So here we go. Hi, everyone, and welcome aboard to our KMGN course, from strategy to change management to impact. And as we know, I'm speaking and I'm emphasizing on the change management part that is now our set of sessions. And we have a small change today. The person that was intended to speak won't be able to speak, but Rudolf found us someone that is even probably much better, Tahagat and Rudolf. I will let you host and invite Tahagat to speak, and you will see for yourself, everyone, that was such much, I won't say much better choice because you don't know the other guy, but it was a wonderful choice. Thank you, Rudolf, and please.
Yes. Good day, everybody. And thank you, Dr. Tathagat Verma, for joining us from Arkansas in the US. It's 7 a.m. out there. Tathagat is with Walmart and maybe till the end of today, I guess. After that, he's shifting to India. He's been an accomplished C-level software executive, entrepreneur, R&D scientist, and he's an established thought leader. He is one of the few people who had started the agile software development movement here in India. And he has been recognized as a LinkedIn top voice in 2024. He has written over 1,000 articles, delivered more than 750 keynotes in AI, agile, lean product development, design thinking, change management, leadership, culture, etc. So I think we have no better speaker for this topic than Tathagat. And his third book is going to be released next month. It's called Cognitive Chasms. It's based on his doctoral research. And maybe he could talk a little bit about it towards the end. Over to you, Tathagat.
Thank you, Rudolph, and thank you, Moria. Thank you for a very kind and generous introduction. I think it's setting a very high expectation, so I have to live up to that.
Yes.
But I'll try my level best. And as Rudolph rightly said, I'm right now, as of right now, this morning, I'm still with Walmart over here in the US. Today is my last working day at Walmart, and what better way to sign off than to do this conversation with all of you. And I will be heading back to Bangalore, which is my hometown for the last 30 years, as I start the new innings. So in this session, and I'll bring up the deck in a moment, well, as Moria was saying that you had the previous speaker drop out, and I hope I can fill in the shoes of the previous speaker. I also have no way of knowing what you were expecting out of it. So please bear with me. And yeah, I'm open to all the suggestions during this time. And if there is any Q&A, we'll take it. Otherwise, we'll have time for the Q&A in the end. So let me just bring up my slide deck, if you will just allow me a minute. And I hope my audio and video is fine, but please let me know if I need to make any changes at my end. Yeah, if someone can please let me know when they can
We see
see
it.
that.
We see
Okay,
it, but
great.
can you move to show mode, please? That's it.
Okay, thank you, Moria. So, so when Rudolph reached out to me, and I had a call with Rudolph and Dr. Moria, and we were discussing how to do that, and we kind of discussed and played around with the idea that I could probably open up the topic so I can kind of open up and show the broader perspective. And then I understand Dr. Moria is going to take another session where she will kind of bring all the ideas together. So this is treated more like a strategy, kind of a divergent thinking, where we are kind of opening up the subject and looking at the range of possibilities. And then once we understand how do we apply some of these ideas, then it's much easier for us to be able to go and narrow it down in some kind of a convergent thinking and say, hey, so it's basically the like Guilford's idea of divergent thinking and convergent thinking. So this particular session is going to focus on the first part of that, which is the divergent thinking aspects. I named it as strategizing the new change, and I'll talk about the new change. What do I mean by that? And I wanted to give it a little broader perspective, not just looking at change management as something that, because management to me has a connotation of us kind of Imagine a shepherd is running behind the sheep, kind of a thing, like you're managing the herd, sort of a thing. I think to me, it is our roles are much bigger, much deeper, much broader than that. So I've just called it as strategizing, but feel free to pick up the right word that fits your mental model, and we'll do that. Yeah, so just as a other short introduction, I did my PhD, executive PhD last year, which was on adoption of generative AI. So I was studying the failure modes of generative AI adoption. I called it as the theory of cognitive chasms. And some of you may be familiar with the work of Jeffrey Moore on crossing the chasm. I've basically taken taken that work and extended that for cognitive technologies like artificial intelligence and generative AI. Happy to talk about it if somebody's interested now or later on. But with that, I will dive into the subject. So just at the outset, I think the beauty about change is that it's not just constant, but the change itself keeps changing all the time. So there's no one single color or flavor of change that we can think of. In the old world, we talked about ideas like predictability or stability or linear causality. Now, guess what? These are all out of the door now because we don't live in a world where there is a very high degree of any of them anymore. And suffice to say that the old change is not the same as the new change. We are really talking about the new change now, where many of these drivers of change or behaviors or characteristics are radically different now. And kind of establishing what is our interest area, what is the knowledge management imperative in change. So as we will discuss, change is not episodic anymore, but it's a constant, it's a new normal. And the bigger challenge is that when we do not plan the change properly, it is undermining the knowledge management initiative. So people are building new platforms, we have new technologies like generative AI and what have you. And that really impedes the cultural shifts that we have. The sad truth about change management is that for a long, unacceptably long period of time, more than two-thirds of the change fail. And this is not just a single point data. This is kind of across industries. You just have to pick a name and give it to it. It is cultural transformation, quality transformation, agile transformation, digital transformation. And now we are talking about AI and agentic adoption. The kind of statistics are mind-boggling and they are disappointing also. A disproportionately high number of them still keep facing major headwinds. And the number and the pace of change is just increasing all the time. Earlier, it used to be smaller number of changes, low intensity, and now we're talking about high intensity, unexpected changes happening multiple times a year and so on. The reason why it is so critical for knowledge management is because the knowledge management really sits at the intersection of strategy and impact. And it's essential that we not only understand how do we really capture this evolving knowledge. The knowledge was tacit, that itself was challenging enough, but now it is evolving and there's no centralization, right? It's very spread out kind of a knowledge there. And how do we really make sure that we are driving the right impact? So those are the kind of challenges. And just to finish off on this slide, the knowledge management role has also significantly undergone a seismic shift now. We are talking about sense making. We're talking about how do we reduce the collective resistance via shared knowledge? And how do we translate the change into a sustained capability for the organization? So that's the kind of a going in position that I will take as we discuss this. So very broadly, if we see, I was referring to this new change. And if we look at it, what has changed now? So many things have changed from the old change to the new one. It used to be more episodic. It used to be slow, localized, bounded. I think bounded is a very key term here. We were used to the idea of seeing that there's a localization and we could literally draw the box around the change and say, hey, this is really the impact boundary of change, whereas it has all but gone now. A lot of times the drivers were coming from the internal strategy that the companies were doing. The externalities that the world was dealing were comparatively on a lower order, and hence the risks were more known. The planning horizon used to, and we all know, right? I mean, we all grew up probably in a world where the 5-year planning was the norm for most of the governments, right? And those kind of things don't really make sense anymore because they were having a semblance of very high predictability, very low risk, very linear kind of an impact, and so on and so forth. The new change is anything but old, right? We are talking about continuous, persistent, amplifying, cascading, radiating changes. There's no notion of boundaries anymore. I'll talk about the whole aspect of complexity that is embedded into this change now. And there are a lot of unknowns because of that, because we don't know how the change is going to manifest at some other time in some other part of the world, and so on there. And hence our planning horizon has to be adaptive, and it has to be more real time than looking at a very long term. We still need to have a long term approach about it, but we need to have a very short term response time to it. A lot of like what Nicholas Taleb would call as the black swan events, right? A lot of black swan events are kind of happening with much more intensity and much higher frequency than ever before. And the impact of these changes are exponential. It is like it just is like an earthquake or a volcanic kind of a thing. It's just radically shifting the whole radius. And hence the decision logic cannot be the same as a top down. There has to be a sense of how do we understand the nature of this distributed intelligence? How do we convert that into collective? How do we do a sense and respond kind of a thinking? So those are very high level sort of contours of the new change. And the new change is radically different. It's not something obviously that has happened overnight. It has been happening over the last 15, 20 years. If we see some of the very high level call outs, I mean, one of the big call outs, for example, many of us may remember was like how Nokia to BlackBerry to iPhone kind of a shifts happened, right? There was this whole notion of a very linear kind of a thinking and keep adding those sort of a feature upgrades, but then radically you have a new delivery model like a app store from iPhone that comes, and it just radically changes the kind of changes that are happening because the change can happen from any developer on the app store. And now how do you deal with that? Similarly, if you think about Netflix versus Blockbuster, or even the COVID, the way it really changed because it didn't give any response time, let alone a preparation. And it was an instant change that caused a global disruption. Or now what we are living through is the whole generative AI. In fact, when I started my PhD, I was working on understanding the adoption modes of plain vanilla AI. And then ChatGPT happened in November 2022. So I was myself, I had a choice. I met a fork in the middle of the road, and I said, if I continue down the old path, I'm not going to get anywhere. I'll finish my PhD, but it will be of no consequence. Should I pivot or should I continue? And I'm glad I pivoted because generative AI turned out to be a much bigger thing than what we have seen before. So those are the kind of things where the companies are forced to abandon their planning, and they have to go into how do we deal with this change now. So it suddenly becomes a burning deck problem for the companies where they thought we are not even in the AI business, we are not even in the tech business, and so on. So that's really the nature of change. So let's just unpack for a moment what is the new change. The way I look at it is the new change is really intentional or emergent disruption. So there's a lot of disruption happening. Where is it happening? It is happening to the system's equilibrium, right? We are used to the whole idea of equilibrium. We call it as BAU, business as usual, or we call it as, in physics, we may call it as steady state kind of a thing. But now we are really gravitating towards dynamic equilibrium. The whole notion of static equilibrium is history. And this requires a continuous juggling, a recalibration of resources, behaviors, and knowledge. Now, we cannot simply say I have recalibrated once and I can kind of keep living off that recalibration. Since the change is happening all the time, we need to constantly be able to recalibrate. And there is this growing gap on a daily basis between the emergent complexity. The complexity is not something that we can fully understand because as I will discuss in the session, the nature of complexity that we are dealing with is very distributed. It's very emergent. And the reality, how do we really make sense of the current reality? And that's where the sense-making frameworks come in. And the new state of stability or survival. In many cases, indeed, we are talking about stability or even survival, an existential crisis, as we may say it. So that is really how I characterize the new change. And hence, the old thinking, the old mental models that we have around change are not quite appropriate, and they are certainly not adequate for dealing with this change, because they were designed in a world where it was a reasonably controlled change. There were no notion of disruptions. The notion of steady state was much stronger than saying that we live in a dynamic equilibrium and so on. So those are the kind of things. So I've already spoken, so I'll just skip this slide because this is just talking about it, and I'll share the slide deck after this, so for your reference. But basically, just describing these ideas before. Now, the big challenge that we have, as I was alluding to earlier, is that change seems to have to be stuck at this kind of a mythical 70% sort of a thing. For the past 30, 40 years, the most common number when we look at is like 70% of the changes fail. Various researchers, academicians, and practitioners have spoken about it. So I'll not go into the details. But the bigger thing is, what is the causality of these failures? Why do they really happen? And that is the whole focus for KM also, that it is shifting, that we are not really interested in the statistics of how many, like is 70 the right number or 60 the right number? That doesn't really matter as much as why they fail is really important. And some of the key factors stand out as people factors or executive overload. But the third one is interest to me personally, complexity misalignment, because a lot of times we don't fully understand the nature and the origin of complexity, and hence we are likely to misapply the tools to diagnose it and then to kind of remediate it. So those are some of the challenges we'll discuss. So the key issues really from a KM point of view, in my understanding, is that a mere categorization, codification, storage, retrieval, and finding the best practices kind of a mental model of KM is not really a defense against the failures. We are talking about how do we really, in a dynamic world, build the whole, the knowledge frameworks, the epistemological origins of how we are constructing the knowledge itself have to undergo radical changes. So the number one issue that I want to talk about is category error. I believe that most of these change management failures stem from not being able to really understand what are we even dealing with. And most of the time we are saying, hey, like for example, many of us may be familiar with frameworks like Kotter's. Kotter is the world authority on change management, right? But those are kind of structural transformation frameworks. If we are talking about applying them for a generative AI kind of a thing where the changes are happening on a daily basis, there's no way a framework like that is going to be the right fit for it. So because those are too slow and so on. So that is really the first thing that I want to talk about. So let's unpack this. Now, there are many ways to slice and dice the change. I've just taken two of them, but you can pick up your own just to kind of make sense of it and see how you want to study the correlation between them. What I've chosen here for this session is the first dimension is the velocity, the rate at which it is happening, obviously, right? If it's a low velocity or high velocity kind of a change. And when the change is occurring, what does it lead to, which is the whole quantum or the magnitude of change. And that again can be a low quantum or a high quantum. So very simple framework. But when I kind of map them on a 2x2 kind of a grid, I get this kind of a grid where I see that in the red box, I see this whole slow change, right? Which is how the evolutionary change, which is how the mother nature changes, right? The whole notion of evolution comes from mother nature, where there is a slow and steady over 1 billion years, you get what we are, right? That kind of a thing there. Now, if you kind of increase the velocity, you kind of see that you still have a low quantum, but you continue to have, like you now have changes happening at a much faster clip. And this is like a more tactical pivot that is needed. which is kind of a constant change sort of a thing. On the y-axis, if you go and you say, hey, we are still dealing with the low velocity, but the quantum is now high, and you kind of start seeing the whole pattern of structural changes, which lead to the structural transformation. And then when both of these are amped up high, you get what I call as a hyper change, because that is like a situation where too many things are happening at a very fast clip, and they have a high impact. So we'll just briefly study all of them. The first one, evolutionary change, is really change is a constant. I call it as the drip feed of slow and steady change. So it's like, imagine that it's literally, if you mentally visualize it, it's literally a drip feed happening there, kind of a thing, right? Now, this was the old world that we were all very comfortable with, right? For example, Kaizen is completely built around this idea. And I don't know how some of you may have come across this lovely book. It was my favorite for many years. I still love this book. The title of the book is a very provocative 40 years, 20 million ideas. And it basically talks about how Kaizen was adopted at Toyota. And during the time period from 1951 to 1991, which was the 40-year period that this book talks about, how the rank and file employees of Toyota gave 20 million ideas bottom up, which kind of led to Toyota becoming what it is today, right? That sort of a thing there. Now that was obviously the whole. So when you get the whole idea of what is a drip feed and how the Kaizen world is going on, and these tools were very good for that kind of a thing, like the whole plan, do, check, act kind of a thinking we have had since Deming days and so on, Schuhart cycle, plan, do, check, and act, the lean Kaizen approach, Six Sigma, total quality management. Basically, the idea is we are looking at like a compounding of the small gains sort of a thing. Works very well in a stable environment. The second thing is what happens when the velocity goes high is we are talking about change as a constant adjustment. So my metaphor for this is like the GPS, like the Google Maps sort of a thing, right? It's constantly rerouting you if you go on the wrong track, or how Edward de Bono would call it as the water logic, right? It doesn't really create a conflict, but wherever the water finds. So as de Bono talked about water logic versus rock logic, to me, this is like the water logic. Water finds its way. It doesn't create a conflict. It doesn't stop. Neither it really seeks to annihilate the rock that blocks it, but it just goes around it and finds the way. So that is the GPS nature, right? It just, if you take a wrong turn, it just finds you another path. So that is a kind of a tactical pivot we are talking about there. It could be any software team, right? In a SaaS world or a web world, like a Twitter feature rollout, or you have something new coming up, you again, so because you literally don't even know what is the notion of a feature or a version number of Facebook anymore, because it's constantly undergoing the changes. Now, obviously, Agile and Scrum and Kanban, and then you have the Eric Ries lean startup model of build, measure, learn kind of a thing. These work very well for that, because you are really talking about a very, very short feedback cycle where the distance between building something to getting the feedback is narrowing all the time, just so that you are able to make faster adjustment to the closed loop. So that kind of works very well in a tactical pivot environment. When we go to the high velocity, the low velocity, high quantum, it kind of starts becoming like a structural sort of a shift. These are like tectonic shifts happening. They are deliberate. They are more deep. They could be proactive as well, but they're very strategic, and they're literally moving to the new state sort of a thing there. So, for example, there may be a bank which had totally on-prem infrastructure, but now they are going to the cloud native environment. Now, this is like a huge project which may take like multiple years to kind of do that work. One of my last work here at Walmart was around digital transformation of all our 10,000 plus stores and clubs, because we had a lot of technology that was legacy. So how do we kind of move away from the from the applications, from the infrastructure, and from the tech stack to the new one, for example. And these would work well, like, for example, you can take Kotter's 8-step process, or EDCAR, many of us may be familiar with that, or the McKinsey 7S, because this is like an OCM sort of a problem where we have a very deliberate alignment between the organizational resources, structure, and the resources that we need to work with. And the last one on that is really leading to what I call as a hyper change or even crisis at times, where the nature is change as a survival. I mean, you have no way to really figure out what is going on. So think of it like a vortex, think of it like shocks, right? Or a perfect storm sort of a thing. These are rapid, they cannot be forecasted. They have very high, unusually high impact. In many cases, the sum is greater than the parts kind of a thing. We don't even realize that there is a non-linearity that has become embedded into these. And that non-linearity, the sum greater than parts, is what we call as the emergence. So emergence is really a property of the complex systems where the sum is greater than the parts. That means we have not seen that property in the individual components, but when they are put together, it takes a life of its own. It's bigger than what the components bring to the table. So this is a kind of a black swan, like NNT talked about it there. I mean, think of how generative AI is just decimating industries after industries because some of these are not just like a lift and shift of a technology from old to the new, but this is kind of just radically changing it. So so they are the frameworks that we have to think of. Our Canadian framework, for example, or complexity. How do we apply with the complex system? So I'll take the complex system and briefly talk about the Canadian framework as well. The second big issue in my understanding is the failure to see complexity, as I was speaking in the last few slides. Now, what tends to happen is that we are very comfortable with, we human beings are essentially sense-making animals, right? Let me use that way. We like to be able to attribute the causes to what we are seeing around us, right? If we are able to attribute a cause to it, we are comfortable because then we know why something is happening, right? So these could be happening because we understand them reasonably well known, or by a simple application of knowledge or logic we can apply. So if we come out in the morning and we see the grass wet, we may say, oh, it might have rained overnight. Or maybe there was a dew in the night, for example. We may not say that the neighboring kids came and deliberately sprayed water over my lawn, right? Now, that may be a possibility. That may be application of inductive or abductive knowledge, logic. But we will still be able to come with a more logical explanation of that. But in the real world, most of the situations, and especially those dealing with people, is really what Ritter and Webel talked about in 1974. They gave a new name to those problems. They said these are wicked problems, and they described 10 characteristics of them. Wicked problems do not really have a finish line. They do not really have a clear logical explanation. And there is a full paper that they wrote about it. And what we find is a lot of problems in the real world, they resemble or they mimic wicked problems. It's not very easy for us to really establish the causality as to why they are happening. And hence what happens is we do not recognize that complexity, and we apply the wrong tools because we only think from the framework that we are comfortable with, right? I mean, that is what basically the whole Simon's theory of rational the bounded rationality was, right? Which is like we optimize it based on what we are knowing and what we are comfortable with, and we kind of do not pursue the entire thing. So that's really the human nature. That's the fickle human nature, and we have to deliberately do that. So spending a few minutes on the complexity aspect of it, if I take this whole complexity lens and I kind of overlay it on the framework that I just described, the 2x2 of velocity and magnitude, we get a very interesting interplay of how failure to understand complexity leads to even more short-chain decisions. And hence it creates even more challenges there because we don't understand the whole idea of cause and effect. So here is, let me explain that. In simple terms, in a linear system, the cause and effect may be equidistant in space and time, which means, so let us say I turn on my stove and I put a pan with water on that. I can very easily see that within a few minutes, the water will start getting heated up. So the cause, which is like applying of the heat to the pan, and the effect, which is getting the water heating up, is kind of very fast, and it's happening at the same place. Now imagine a world where, for example, you did something and you were not able to see the effect of that for next 3 months. So you don't even know what, if anything is happening. And even if there was a manifestation of the effect, that if you tried something in, let us say, Europe, and the effect was seen in Australia. Would you ever be able to correlate these two, let alone establish the causality? It's going to be extremely difficult because you are not even sitting there. You are not even there to describe that phenomena. And in fact, the first person who really described this phenomena was the MIT scientist Edward Lorenz in 1967. He wrote this very provocatively titled paper, which is like, does the flap of a butterfly in Amazon rainforest cause a tornado in Texas? And the whole idea was that, can these very small things that are happening in point A lead to something else in point B, maybe at some other period in time? These are the kind of things that we are talking about when we deal with the complex systems. In a linear system, the cause and effect are happening adjacent to each other, sequentially coupled. But in a complex system, they are very decoupled, and hence it is not easy to diagnose them. And that is the reason why we misunderstand the nature of change, because the origin of that is not simply saying how do I deal with these various resources and behaviors, but the nature of manifestation itself is not explainable to the lay people, right? So if we apply this lens now on the change grid, we see some more behaviors that we need to understand. In the evolutionary change, the causality is very linear. We understand how things are happening. The feedback loops are very tight and very visible. So as I gave the example, you turn on the heat, you see the flame on the gas stove, and you can see how the water is getting heated up there, right? It's a very simple world. Now, the challenge obviously is that if all I'm seeing is this kind of a problem, I'm likely to assume that everything is oversimplified like that, right? So it can create a mental model that everything is a linear one, and I refuse to acknowledge the presence of complexity if all I'm used to is the idea of a linear causality. And the interventions are obviously, if I see from a knowledge management perspective, we understand the causality. We can apply best practices, we can codify them, we can create the checklist. It works for a long period of time. Except when there is a tendency that, hey, we get too desensitized to the whole idea, and then we are not able to recognize when there is a new kind of a problem. When we talk about the tactical pivot, we are beginning to think of a sequential causality. So you have multiple steps, and there is some kind of a sequentiality to the whole thing, and there are feedback loops that are happening from one to the previous one. And this would be a rather moderate complexity. We typically, in the complex systems, we call it as complicated. We still don't call it as complex because there is a different term. There is a distinction we make within the complex systems between complicated and complex, even though in colloquial English we tend to kind of use them. And this requires an expertise. So let's say most of us probably do not have a mechanical wristwatch anymore, but when we have a mechanical wristwatch, it typically has roughly about 130 components. Now, these 130 components are put in a specific order. They are not just randomly put there inside a metal case. They will work only if they are linearly connected to each other, and the causality is essentially transferring the potential energy to the kinetic energy and the movement and so on and so forth. Can we, who are lay people who are not trained to diagnose the fault in a mechanical wristwatch, can we look at a dead wristwatch and say what may be wrong with that? Chances are very low. But with sufficient expertise and training, somebody may be able to quickly figure out, hey, this particular mechanism is broken and I need to be able to do that. So with application of logic, with sufficient training and expertise, you can do the diagnostic, and with sufficient expertise, you can do the remediation of that kind of an issue. Now, the challenge from a management point of view is that there are too many parts they are connected, it can be difficult to really sift through the noise and look at that signal. So that is really a big challenge there. Agile is one way that we can do, because you start with a small step, you really focus on what is important, you sense the data and you respond it, and you basically quickly keep closing the loop so that you are able to keep narrowing it down and keep zero down into what is really important. So that's kind of a very tactical way in which how we are looking at it. Change management, building the right knowledge for it, and really saying how can I apply the change management which is commensurate with the nature of knowledge, with the whole relationships and the epistemology of knowledge. How are we kind of curating it? When we go to the third quadrant, we start looking at how the causality is gradually getting decoupled. That means the cause and effect do not appear to be one single event, but they are looking as two different events, and we have no knowledge, expertise, or tools available to kind of connect them and say, hey, are these really the same kind of a thing, right? So, for example, you may have some changes may be happening in the headquarters, but the effect is manifesting in the satellite office, which is like few miles away or few cities away, or it may be happening after 1 year or 2 years, and we don't even know why this is happening. Like one of the examples that I was reading in Economist, I think there was this article last week, and it was analyzing that how in China, for example, even though the one-child policy has been taken off, most of the young couples are still not changing their behaviors, and they are saying that, hey, we are still in a one-child country, and because of which the whole population of China is actually in a decline now. They are also officially entering less than the replenishment rate, for example. So now you have a situation, because you cannot easily attribute it to just behavior or say economics, that, oh no, it costs a lot of money to have kids and so on and so forth. Probably you'll have to go back in time and really understand those cultural barriers to what happened and how these things happened, because this is like a long sequence of how these events have happened, and we cannot easily establish the link to the original cause and the effect that we are seeing, because there is a time lag and there is a distal effect that is at play here. Now, we have to apply systems thinking in solving some of these problems. We have to be able to understand the ideas of stocks and flows, as we know, like Donella Meadows' kind of work, for example, really understand the whole systems thinking and so on. Because otherwise, we may just be kind of groping in the dark and trying out things which are just likely to frustrate us. And the last one is really where the whole causality is not only decoupled, it is emergent. That means you have a behavior that is not even seen in the components. So, for example, some of the most famous work is from a guy by name Thomas Schelling, who got the Nobel Prize in 1960s, an economist, because he was studying segregation, the racial discrimination and segregation. And one of the things that he found was that, for example, nobody individually is really having those kind of prejudices. But then, and all they have is, like in his experiment, he showed that people may have a preference, and the preference is, hey, I like to live next to people where at least 30% of the people are like me. Now, that is what Schelling demonstrated. Now, this could be a very individual behavior, an individual disposition around what I am comfortable with. But then when you blow it up at scale, you realize that this leads to a full-blown segregation in cities. And he got Nobel Prize for basically explaining the causality of that. So, or if you would have seen a swarm of the starling birds, right? Or if you have seen in nature, this kind of a behavior is very common in complex systems. A stock market is exactly like that. Can we say that one single factor led to the crash or meltdown or hitting the lower circuit on a stock market? It doesn't happen like that. Or where I come from in Bangalore, for example, traffic jams are something that are a daily realities, right? Can we say this is like one single thing that started a traffic jam? So those are the kind of things where it's very easy. There is a circularity and non-linearity, and it's not easy for us to go back in time and say this is where it got started. It's very difficult to isolate the root cause of that, and that becomes really the big challenge of that. And there is this whole perpetual illusion of control, because if I have been a traditional manager, if all I have done is applied the whole simple if then else kind of a logic, I'm probably going to see that as a hammer and I can hit every nail with that. But this is going to fail because there is no predictability. In fact, one of the properties of complex system is if you know the previous state, you cannot predict the next state. So in computer science, we call it as the finite state machine. So you are able to make the state transitions. You say if at time is t is equal to t, the state is A, you can mathematically and algorithmically predict that at time t plus 1, what will be the next state of that. And if the current state is at t plus 1, I can go back in time, and most of the time I'm able to say what was the previous state. None of this really works in a complex system because the whole idea of a finite state machine doesn't work. In fact, in AI, we are beginning to see a lot of stochastic, non-deterministic kind of a logic is mimicking that behavior. Can we say why ChatGPT gives us the answer that it gives? And yet it gives those answers. The bias, nobody is baking in the bias into that. Nobody is baking in hallucinations into the logic of generative AI. And yet it demonstrates that behavior. Now, there are multiple reasons for it. But if we don't even understand what is happening, we are very likely to misunderstand and hence misdiagnose it and just apply the hammer that we are used to, which is like there is a linearity between cause and effect. I will apply this, I will apply 7S, I will apply Kotter, and I will kind of do that. So if my lens through which I'm constructing the knowledge, the epistemological lens that I'm constructing my knowledge with, is essentially a very modernist kind of a lens, which is like there is a specific cause and effect, there is only one cause for it, I'm likely to fail. But if I take a postmodernist kind of a lens where I'm able to say there can be multiple reasons why something is happening, what we call as a polytely, there can be multiple paths to diagnosing it. We are more likely to succeed rather than saying there is only one single fixed way of doing it, which also leads to different kind of intervention styles. Because if we are able to really zero down on the right domain, the right quadrant, only then we are more likely to succeed. But if we don't even understand that there are these four, at the least four quadrants, and if we only apply one single method, the change management is going to be terribly frustrating to us, right? And one of the best frameworks that I think we have is the whole Canadian framework. I'll not go into the details, but this is something which Dave Snowden has given, and I think we are very familiar, many of us, which gives a very good similar kind of a, if you see it kind of mimics the 2x2. Dave would fiercely disagree with that. It is not really meant for such kind of a classification. He calls it a categorization framework, sense-making framework. But when you start looking at a problem, the way you are epistemologically constructing the knowledge is how you are going to really manage those changes with, right? So if we understand, hey, this is in the clear quadrant or it's in the clear or complicated, then we have a different set of tools and kind of doing it. So Canadian framework is a good way to start with. How do we do sense making and then apply the right kind of a tool into that? So just to kind of wind up in the next 2 minutes, the knowledge management has some key management challenges, like how do we navigate ambiguity with incomplete information? How do we integrate the tacit knowledge in a fast-moving context, right? Like if you look at generative AI, one of my favorite phrases around generative AI is, or during COVID was also that everybody has exactly equal amount of experience in dealing with COVID, right? So nobody is an expert, and somebody who's claiming they are an expert are bluffing basically, right? Because everybody is having the same access to the experience and knowledge and so on. So how do you deal with that? And supporting cross-functional collaboration in complex systems. So these are the kind of management challenges that knowledge management must deal with. And the recommended strategies would really be in terms of saying, hey, how do we build this knowledge real-time flows? Like NASA is a great way in really how do they build these kind of flows, and these are not built around static libraries alone. Using the whole narrative capture and micro sense making, so Canadian kind of a thinking, but also using the power of narrative and not just looking at hard, concrete, quantitative data, but being able to look at subjective, qualitative data, and being able to make sense out of the whole thing. And finally, don't equate learning with having basically an establishment of knowledge or codification or curation or repositories, but living, breathing ecosystems that basically rely on the communities of practice. So these are the kind of strategies that may be useful. The key takeaways, in my view, is I think this the second line is important in the core thesis. When causality is linear, knowledge management can act as a map, because it can really tell people how to deal with that, right? I mean, think of it like Indiana Jones starting out with a map, because that is the map, and then Indiana Jones following the map. But when causality is emergent, which is what Indiana Jones ends up doing, the knowledge management has to be a compass. It has to be in a position to, like a GPS, like a compass, help find the way and not just tell the way, kind of a thing there, right? And just lastly, to conclude it, the new change is really faster, larger, more interconnected, more complex. We are not dealing with individual parts where we can compartmentalize the change, and we have the luxury of saying, I understand the causality, I can apply this. The knowledge is more limited, bounded kind of a problem. But it is all about managing the enabling these adaptive capacity. How do we really prepare the organization to do that? Are we going to let the organization become a burning deck problem, or we see ourselves as people who have the knowledge, training, and expertise to actually enable this adaptive capacity? So my view would be that knowledge management needs to shift from static repository approach. I know it is not really anymore into that world, but has to be really more into dynamic sense making, because we are not talking about best practices alone. We are talking about next practices. We are talking about patterns that are essentially emergent. How do you kind of spot a pattern, and how do you kind of build a fractal out of it and say, okay, everything else is really kind of a repetition or tessellation of some of these fractals. It must enable collective intelligence across distributed teams. Gone are the days when knowledge was the elite preserve of the so-called headquarters approach. In a complex system, the knowledge is in a mesh. Everybody, and especially more rank and file, especially more at the periphery of the networks, are more likely to have latest current knowledge. So for example, if you are building products, how are you going to curate the knowledge around it? Are you going to go to the process experts who are sitting in an ivory tower? Or you will go to actually the customer service and say, let me look at the logs and see where the problems are coming from. That is probably going to be more richer in information. So if we go with that as the primary source, then we can be more successful. Support continuous learning loops rather than very episodic kind of changes, and not a one-time training. It has to be something which is a continuous learning loop. And finally, it must be able to understand how to sense, interpret, and act before choosing a framework. Just because we have framework doesn't mean that any framework is going to fit at in any situation, as I said. So the category error to me is really the first big cardinal sin, and the second one is really failure to recognize the capacity. Lastly, just to conclude, I would say, if the mental model in the process control world in 50s, 60s, 70s, right, in the words of famous big ones like Deming and Peter Drucker, was you cannot manage what you cannot measure. I would say that today we have entered into an era where we must recognize you cannot manage what you cannot classify. If you do not really know what is the origin of it, what is the genesis of this problem, how does this manifest in terms of cause and effect relationship, we may never construct the knowledge in the right way. And if we don't construct the knowledge in the right way, we are liable to misapply the change management frameworks. So that's really some of the thoughts that I thought I will share in this call. I'll pause here and stop sharing it and give it back to Dr. Moria and Rudolf. If you have time, I'm happy to have a Q&A. Thank you. I think you're on mute.
Moria, you're on mute.
Thank you, Dr. Varma. I think that we better understood the attributes and the essence of change nowadays and its implications on knowledge management, even before we speak about our change management in our journey to realize the KM solutions and business needs based on the knowledge. There were several wonderful discussions on the chat. So I'd like to call people from the chat, and please, if you can share some of these orally, and we will hear also what Dr. Varma has to add, that would be wonderful. Anahit, do you want to start? Okay, no, so someone else? If there's any other
Maybe
question,
Martin,
yes.
maybe Martin, would you like to air your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm not sure if Martin, but I was reading Martin's comment and I liked it. I think it's a great question. That what Anahit said, it's a like more like an ECG, and the flat line is not so good. The real challenge is how do we distinguish between good ECG noise and versus cardiac arrest? I think the metaphor is interesting, and that's where I think the whole Canadian framework is good, because as Snowden talks about, he brings this whole idea and distinction between fail safe and safe to fail. Those of you who are familiar with Canadian framework would be able to recognize that a lot of times we essentially build systems that we think are fail safe. That means they are guaranteed not to fail and so on. But he says that a better way to deal with in a complex situation is really to build these micro probes, which he calls as safe to fail, which means these are small experiments, A/B experiments or multivariate experiments. And even if one individual experiment fails, it does not really hurt you. It doesn't really kill your company, but it actually allows you to keep moving forward. And the smaller experiments have a much shorter feedback cycle, so you are able to do that. Now, when you do that at scale, imagine if you are able to build a platform and run like thousands of those experiments every single day. The amount of learning that you can do with this approach is huge. So great question, great perspective, Martin. The recommended approach is to really think in terms of safe to fail probes, which can really help you to keep moving forward.
I want to ask
Tatagat,
you.
there are two questions.
Yes, okay, please,
Sorry,
first
Moria, there
questions.
are two
No,
questions.
no,
So
that's
I think let
even better,
let
yes.
Patrick ask his question, followed by Alexandra. Patrick, go ahead.
Hello. Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
No, thank you very much for excellent presentation. I love the way that you presented it through the change lens and that perspective. So my question really was, what you spoke to really does focus on the human component of net KM. So again, if you think about KM as being that iceberg where you have the explicit stuff that sits on top and then all the tacit stuff that sits below the water, what you spoke to, and I completely agree, does focus more on that tacit stuff that sits below the water. The challenge that I have seen, and I think continues to be perhaps even more because of the whole AI sort of bandwagon thing, is that we are ignoring the human component. And so I'm just wondering, and again, I know that today is your last day at Walmart, but in your experience, is Walmart, have they looked, have you been able to share that, what you shared with us today with them? And are they looking at that as part of their sort of strategic planning?
No, absolutely, Patrick. Great question. And yeah, I mean, I'm not obviously the official spokesperson for Walmart, but I can, the way as an associate working on the last day, but even otherwise, I think many people do not know, but Walmart has 2.2 million associates, the largest private employer in the world. And I think it's not an exaggeration that nobody knows the value of people as Walmart does. A lot of people have varied experiences. I recognize that, but I've not seen the technology has really been used to displace it. I mean, if you think about it, probably the biggest cost item a company like Walmart. And again, I'll take another 30 seconds on that. Most of the people may not be familiar that by design, the Fortune 1 company with almost 800 billion revenue, the net margins that we work with is only about roughly about 2% types. So that's by design, actually, because the whole idea of Mr. Sam Walton saying, let's help people save money so that they can live a better life, meant that we are passing down these savings to the customers, and not really as a company we are hoarding the profits there. So if you think logically, most of the companies are saying people are their biggest cost item, and they are trying to get rid of it. You think about large company CEOs saying that we'll cut off headcount 20%, 30%. Walmart is not doing it. A lot of AI that has been around for 10 years in Walmart, and the last 5 years that generative AI and others are coming. The approach has been, how do we give the power? I talked about this whole distributed way of knowledge making, and that's exactly the kind of thing I see. Each associate, there are 800,000 associates who are day in and day out walking inside the stores with the smartphone, which allows them all the micro signals to be captured. How many items in the shelf? How much of the items are being consumed? When are we replenishing? All this data is getting captured through that, and then we have started to essentially monetize it. If you go on Google and look at Walmart Data Ventures, we have actually built a business unit out of it where we are monetizing this data. So the same data we are using to essentially do the demand forecasting, we are also selling to our customers. And people and the technology is being seen as an enabler to the people who are doing their job, and not as something that's replacing them lock, stock, and barrel. So the current approach so far, what I've seen, is very heartening to me personally. I would say that technology is being seen as a productivity enabler, and not really as a lot of people who are taking a knee-jerk reaction to. Now, I'll stop my my commercial plug around it, but that's at least, Patrick, how I see the whole thing right now. I hope that helps.
Thank you.
I do see there's a question from Alexandre, if anyone would like to use the time. And
no, I can ask the question to Tatagat. No problem. So my question is simple. How do you succeed in convincing organization to set up a KM framework? And second question, or addendum to the question, do we speak about the explicit/codified one, or the implicit tacit one? What is the key of your success?
Yeah, no, I'm not an expert on KM. I'll be very honest. I think you all know KM better than me. So I would respectfully decline the first one. I think it may be a bigger question. The second one definitely is very close to my heart. I think we have seen that how 90s, like in 90s when I used to work at companies like Siemens and Philips, we were talking about things like European Quality Award or Malcolm Baldrige, or the whole idea of a process control and Six Sigma. That was essentially built around the whole paradigm of codified or explicit knowledge. And in fact, in software industry, we made the same mistake. We thought manufacturing was the right paradigm and software was really a production problem. And that is why the whole CMM and everything failed in software industry, because software is not a production problem. Software is a design problem. And most of the knowledge is really tacit knowledge. So I think over a period of time, we have come closer to the idea of software knowledge is tacit. But now I would apply the complexity lens and say it is not even tacit knowledge, it's an emergent knowledge, which means if 5 of us are meeting at a cafeteria today, we will have conversations and the knowledge is going to be constructed impromptu. That's a very emergent knowledge. The same 5 people are sitting in another place, in a football field or in a pub, and they are talking about it. You would have yet another instantiation of the knowledge creation happening. And we need to be able to capture those knowledge flows essentially to do that. So we cannot just say that it's a tacit and say, okay, how do I do it? But it's emergent, and that's a new lens to me. So just some perspectives on that, Alexandre.
Okay, thanks.
I think that takes us to the end of our meeting today. Thank you so much, Tatagat. And next week we will be speaking about storytelling. We saw the idea of storytelling more than once, but now we want to look at it in the perspective of change management. So people, thank you for joining today. Next week, same hour, 12 UTC, whatever time it is in your country.
Thanks, Moria. Thanks, Rudolf, for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. And please don't forget
to
sending me the updated slide deck.
I'll do that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Tatagat.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.